The spectacle of nearly 7 million Americans flooding the streets from Los Angeles to New York, from Chicago to Charleston on October 18th, was not merely a protest, but a civilizational rebuke. When citizens arranged their bodies on Ocean Beach to spell out "No Kings" in letters visible from the sky, when they march past a militarized ice facility in Portland, dressed as inflatable frogs and dancing to techno music, when they gather at the Lincoln Memorial wearing tricorn hats and Revolutionary War costumes, they are engaged in something more profound than political theater. They are performing an exorcism of the authoritarian demon that has possessed the American body politic. The provocation was systematic and deliberate. Here was a president who, barely 9 months into his second term, had already deployed the National Guard to Los Angeles, Washington, Portland, Chicago, and Memphis, all Democratic cities naturally, under the thinnest of pretexts. The man who once said he wanted his generals to be more like Hitler's generals finally got his wish: uniformed troops patrolling American streets, not to defend against foreign invasion or quell insurrection, but to intimidate protesters numbering in the dozens, to guard immigration facilities from peaceful demonstrations, to project federal power into cities whose mayors had the temerity to oppose him. Consider the Portland deployment, where Trump declared the city war-ravaged and besieged by Antifa and other domestic terrorists. The reality? Police reported protests of 20 or fewer people, what a federal judge, appointed by Trump himself no less, described as largely sedate gatherings. Yet this warranted federalizing 200 National Guard troops against the explicit wishes of Oregon's governor, the first time since Lyndon Johnson sent troops to Selma that such an override had occurred. The historical parallel is instructive. Johnson deployed troops to protect civil rights demonstrators from racist mobs. Trump deployed them to protect concrete buildings from drum circles. The MAGA movement's response to the protests revealed the depth of their contempt for democratic expression. House Speaker Mike Johnson, that sanctimonious theocrat who believes his elevation to power was divinely ordained, called them Hate America rallies, and accused Chuck Schumer of siding with Marxists, socialists, the Antifa advocates, the anarchists, and the pro-Hamas wing of the far-left Democrat Party. The invocation of Hamas was particularly rich, given that the protests had nothing whatsoever to do with Middle Eastern politics and everything to do with American constitutional principles. But then, when you've abandoned reason for demagoguery, why let relevance constrain your rhetoric? This is the same Mike Johnson who presides over a House that has enabled Trump's every authoritarian impulse, who stands silent as the president unilaterally terminates union contracts covering 1 million federal workers, who offers not a whisper of protest as masked ICE agents conduct raids with the theatrical menace of secret police. The man who clutches his Bible while shredding the Constitution deserves a special place in the pantheon of American quislings. The international dimension of the protests was equally telling. When crowds gather outside American embassies from London to Rome, from Paris to Toronto, holding signs reading "No tyrants and no dictators," the world is sending a message that transcends partisan politics. They recognize what many Americans, stupefied by propaganda and exhausted by perpetual crisis, have failed to grasp: that the United States under Trump has become a cautionary tale about democratic decline. When a member of the German Bundestag asks visiting Americans, "You saved us from fascism at the end of World War II. How in the world can it be rising in your own country today?" The question answers itself. The deployment of National Guard troops to American cities represents more than mere authoritarian overreach. It's a deliberate strategy of normalization. Get Americans accustomed to seeing military vehicles on their streets, federal agents in tactical gear occupying their neighborhoods, and soon the extraordinary becomes mundane. This is how democracies die, not always in dramatic coups, but through the steady erosion of norms, the incremental expansion of executive power, the gradual acceptance of the unacceptable. Trump's invocation of Title 10, Section 12406, a statute meant for genuine rebellions and foreign invasions, to justify these deployments is legal sophistry of the highest order. Federal judges, including his own appointees, have consistently ruled that peaceful protests and minor disturbances don't constitute the kind of emergency that would justify military intervention. Yet the deployments continue, the appeals mount, and the Supreme Court, now packed with Federalist Society automatons who confuse originalism with selective historical amnesia, waits in the wings to provide post hoc justification for executive tyranny. The protests themselves embodied a peculiarly American form of resistance, part carnival, part constitutional seminar, part primal scream. Veterans like Sean Howard, who served in Iraq only to watch military tactics deployed against American cities, stood alongside teenagers in inflatable dinosaur costumes, federal workers fired without cause and working without pay during Trump's government shutdown, marched next to celebrities and senators. The message was clear. This coalition spans every demographic, every geography, every political tendency except one, the tendency toward authoritarianism. What terrifies the MAGA faithful most about these protests is not their size but their spirit. These were not the angry mobs they could caricature as violent extremists. These were joyful assemblies, complete with marching bands, dance parties, and an almost festive atmosphere. The Portland protesters who responded to Trump's war-ravaged rhetoric by showing up in inflatable frog costumes understood something fundamental. Fascism thrives on fear and withers in the face of mockery. You cannot maintain the gravitas necessary for authoritarianism when your opponents are literally dancing in the streets dressed as amphibians. The Republican Party's transformation under Trump represents the complete abandonment of any principled conservatism. These are not the inheritors of Burke or even Reagan. They are the political equivalent of a protection racket, offering safety from the chaos they themselves create. When Trump tells Fox News, "I'm not a king," while simultaneously deploying troops without gubernatorial consent, while firing federal workers en masse, while treating the Constitution as a suggestion rather than supreme law, we see the kind of doublespeak Orwell warned us about. War is peace, freedom is slavery, and apparently autocracy is democracy. The historical echoes are impossible to ignore. When protesters don Revolutionary War costumes and carry signs reading "No kings, no tyrants," they're invoking the founding spirit of American resistance to arbitrary power. The irony that Trump's birthday coincides with the Army's anniversary, the same army that defeated King George's forces, was not lost on the demonstrators. Here was a president celebrating military might while using it against his own citizens, missing entirely the point that American military strength was born from rejecting exactly the kind of executive overreach he embodies. The international protests underscore a tragic reversal in American standing. Once the beacon of democracy, the United States under Trump has become what other democracies organize against. When Londoners march past the American embassy carrying signs that read "No dictators," when Parisians gather to protest American authoritarianism, when Canadians declare "No fascism, not here, not now," they're not engaging in anti-Americanism, but in pro-American values that America's own government has abandoned. What we witnessed on October 18th was not merely a protest, but a reclamation. 7 million Americans and countless international allies declared that democracy is not a spectator sport, that constitutional governance is not optional, that the American experiment, however tattered, is worth defending. They understood what every generation must learn anew, that democracy is not a state but a practice, not an inheritance but a choice made daily by citizens who refuse to bow before would-be kings. The MAGA movement represents the antithesis of American values, a cult of personality masquerading as populism, authoritarianism dressed in the flag, tyranny wrapped in grievance. They have confused strength with brutality, leadership with domination, patriotism with submission to a single man's will. They are what the founders warned against, what previous generations fought against, what these 7 million protesters rose against. The question now is whether this massive display of democratic solidarity will translate into sustained resistance. Protests, however large, are not sufficient to stop authoritarianism. They must be coupled with political organization, legal challenges, and most importantly, the moral courage to maintain opposition even when, especially when, the costs mount. The Trump administration's response to these protests, deploying more troops, making more threats, attempting to criminalize dissent, tells us everything about their intentions and nothing about our obligations. The No Kings protests proved that Americans have not yet forgotten what their country is supposed to represent. In every inflatable frog costume, in every Revolutionary War hat, in every homemade sign declaring "We the people," there beats the heart of democratic resistance. The would-be kings and their court of sycophants, enablers and opportunists should take note. America was born in rejection of monarchy, and that rejection, however tested, remains encoded in the national DNA. You can deploy all the troops you want, invoke whatever emergency powers you please, wrap yourself in whatever constitutional misinterpretations your court jesters provide, but you cannot make Americans bow to a king, not without a fight. And on October 18, 2025, 7 million Americans showed they're ready for that fight.